Good afternoon. Happy Wednesday. Hump day. Though it hardly feels like that for those of us who are stuck in quarantine. But never fear, there's always time to read. So, for those of you whose first time it is, we're taking this quarantine story time to read aloud from a little book known as War and Peace by Leo Tolstoy. And this particular version is translated from the original Russian by Richard Pevear and Larissa Volokhonsky. Credit where it's due. And hello to those of you who are joining first time, and those who are returning, and to those who've subscribed to the channel. Thank you so much. That's very kind. Hopefully it helps keep you abreast of when this is happening. But it should be pretty close to 3 Monday through Friday. If you need to catch up, I have a playlist. It'll be in a link in the description of this video once it's done. But it's just a War and Peace playlist, and it has each reading numbered, or you can see they're also in order by date. So you can catch up and use it for some light background, free audiobook. My apologies, though, for the horrible pronunciation, occasionally of the Russian names, but often of the copious amounts of French that is being found in this book, which, as we've discussed, is actually due to the fact that, historically speaking, French was the language of diplomats and high society in Europe during the period this book takes place. So it's not unusual for people in court or wealthier families to speak some or, a lot of French, and to engage with that in their society life. And speaking of society life, we just finished some sections that are on the Rostov family, who is a wealthy family in Moscow, and they were having a name day celebration for the Countess and their youngest daughter. And it sounded like quite a party, lots of eating, lots of drinking and dancing. And the father, the Count, seems like quite of a hilarious dude. Pierre was there, and he's the bastard son of the different Count, who is apparently dying, quite wealthy and apparently dying, and they're not sure who his fortune's going to go to. Also, we were introduced in these last segments to Maria Dmitrievna, who is, they call her the Dragon Lady because she's like this outspoken, large woman with a very large personality who says whatever she wants to whenever she wants to. And everyone always is talking about what she said whenever, not like, I guess, behind her back, but also just like she's much talked about, and she it seems like she probably wouldn't care because she says whatever she thinks anyways, so she don't care if people talk about her. Also, if you guys have any comments, the live chat's up. Feel free to drop any questions or comments, and give me feedback too if you like. I had some feedback that the sound might be a little tinny, which could be because I'm recording directly from my laptop. So I may need to see about getting an external mic for better sound quality. But it could also just be the person's device who gave me the feedback. So feel free to let me know how the sound quality is from your end. And it sounds like we're picking up some of the ambient noise in the background, which is, Vincent's playing the piano. So that's always a nice background sound. It's perfect, actually, for classical reading to have some beautiful piano playing. So I'm glad we're getting a little bit of that, and there's not other noise like they were cutting the grass the other day or something. I've been playing some Tchaikovsky. Yeah, I should. Actually, he's working on a really difficult piece by Chopin right now, one of the Polonaises. So, I mean, not particularly at this moment, but that's what he's trying. He used to know it before, but he hasn't played it in a while, and it's one of those like muscle memory things that doesn't come back quite as fast. So he's having to like really study it. Maybe I shouldn't tell you that, but yeah, he's working hard, and he's playing for several hours every day. So it's nice. Wonderful to have the house full of music. Makes me want to pick up an instrument. So, all right, well, I've prattled away long enough. Let's jump into it. So we're going to read, pick up where we left off last time. And so just a reminder, we're still in volume 1 of War and Peace, in part 1 of that volume. And we're going to pick up in sections 18 and do 18, 19, and 20 today. And I'll look into it, but originally this book was published as a serial, so kind of like a literary miniseries, like in a magazine or something, when it was originally written. So I'm not sure if each of these sections was like if 18 was published one day and then 19 came out the following week. But so you can kind of get a sense of like the literary miniseries, the way it was broken up in that way, as opposed to like maybe your traditional chapters, which might have had a different sort of, there's a different sort of intention and directive when you're breaking it up like a miniseries, where you want to like keep people coming back for what happens next, versus like a chapter book where maybe you break it up based on events or periods of time or something. But you can also use chapters and chapter books the same way, as a miniseries. So maybe I'm just don't know what I'm talking about, prattling on, making random wild accusations, but just something to think about as far as background stuff. So let's go ahead and get started with it. Yeah, but Russian music, really. Yeah, I should get some of the piano in the background to be like Russian. Right now, I think it's just jazzy, so that's all right. Hopefully it lends something to the quality of the reading today. All right. Section 18. Just as the 6th Anglaise was being danced in the Rostovs' ballroom to the sounds of the weary, out-of-tune musicians, and the weary servants and cooks were preparing supper, Count Bezukhov was in his 6th stroke. The doctors declared that there was no hope of recovery. The sick man was given a blank confession and communion. Preparations for extreme unction were made, and the house was filled with the bustle and anxiety of expectation usual at such moments. Outside the house, beyond the gate, avoiding the carriages that drove up, undertakers crowded in anticipation of a rich order for the Count's funeral. The commander-in-chief of Moscow, who had constantly been sending adjuncts to ask after the Count's health, came in person that evening to take leave of Catherine's celebrated courtier, Count Bezukhov. The magnificent reception room was filled. Everyone rose deferentially when the commander-in-chief, having spent about half an hour alone with the sick man, came out, responding slightly to the bows and trying to go quickly past the looks that doctors, clergymen, and relations directed at him. Prince Vasily, grown thin and pale during those days, accompanied the commander-in-chief and quietly repeated something to him several times. Having seen the commander-in-chief off, Prince Vasily sat by himself on a chair in the hall, his legs crossed high up, his elbows resting on his knee, his hand over his eyes. Having sat like this for some time, he got up and with unhabitually hurried steps, looking around with frightened eyes, went down the long corridor to the rear of the house, to the eldest princess. Those who were in the dimly lit room talked together in broken whispers, and fell silent each time, turning with eyes full of inquiry and expectation to the door which led to the dying man's room, and which made a faint noise whenever someone went in or came out. A limit has been set, said a little old man, a clerical person, to a lady who sat beside him and listened to him naively. A limit has been set to human life which cannot be overstepped. I wonder if it's not too late to give extreme unction, the lady asked, adding his clerical title as if she had no opinion on the subject. It's a great sacrament, my dear, the clerical person responded, passing his hand over his bald head, which had several strands of half-gray hair combed over it. Who was that? The commander-in-chief himself? Someone asked at the other end of the room. What a youthful man. He's in his 70s. Well, so they say. The Count no longer recognizes anyone? Do they mean to give him extreme unction? I knew a man who received extreme unction 7 times. The second princess came out of the sick man's room with tearful eyes and sat down next to Dr. Lorraine, who was sitting in a graceful pose under a portrait of Catherine, leaning his elbow on a table. Très beau, the doctor said, in reply to a question about the weather. Très beau, princesse, et Moscow en secret à la campagne. N'est-ce pas? Said the princess, sighing. So he's allowed to drink? Lorraine pondered. Has he taken his medicine? Yes. The doctor looked at his Brugeot. Take a glass of boiled water and put it in un pincy. With his slender fingers he showed what un pincy meant. De crematoire tai. There has been no occasion, a German doctor said to an adjunct, that one remains alive after a second stroke. And he was such a fresh man, said the adjunct, and to whom will all that wealth go? He added in a whisper. There will be no lack of seekers, the German said, smiling. Everyone looked at the door again. It creaked, and the second princess, having prepared the drink prescribed by Lorraine, carried it to the sick man. The German doctor went over to Lorraine. He may still last until tomorrow morning? The German doctor asked in poorly pronounced French. Lorraine, compressing his lips, wagged his finger sternly and negatively in front of his nose. Tonight, no later, he said softly, with a decent smile of self-satisfaction at being able to clearly understand and explain the patient's condition, and walked away. Meanwhile, Prince Vasily had opened the door to the princess's room. The room was in semi-darkness. Only 2 icon lamps burned before the icons, and there was a good smell of incense and flowers. The whole room was filled with small furniture, little chiffoniers, cupboards, and tables. Behind a screen, the white covers of a high feathered bed could be seen. A little dog barked. Ah, it's you, mon cousin? She got up and straightened her hair, which was always, even now, so extraordinarily smooth that it seemed varnished and of one piece with her head. What, has something happened? She said. I'm so frightened. Nothing, it's all the same. I have only come to talk with you, Katish, about business, said the prince, sitting with an air of fatigue in the armchair from which she had gotten up. How warm you keep it, though, he said. We'll sit down here, cousins. I thought something had happened, said the princess, and with her unchanging stern and stony expression, she sat down opposite the prince and prepared to listen. I want to get some sleep, mon cousin, but I can't. Well, and so, my dear, said Prince Vasily, taking the princess's hand and putting it down, as was his habit. It was clear that this and so referred to many things they both understood without naming them. And the princess, with her dry and straight waist, incongruously long for her legs, looked straight and passionlessly at the prince with her prominent gray eyes. She shook her head and, sighing, turned to look at the icons. Her gesture could have been interpreted either as an expression of sorrow and devotion or an expression of weariness and hope for a speedy repose. Prince Vasily interpreted this gesture as an expression of weariness. And do you think it's any easier for me? He said. Je suis orienté comme un cheval de poste. But all the same, I must talk with you, Katish, and very seriously. Prince Vasily fell silent, and his cheeks began to twitch nervously, now on one side, now on the other, giving his face an unpleasant expression, which never appeared on Prince Vasily's face when he was in a drawing room. His eyes were also not the same as usual. Now they looked with insolent jocularity, now they glanced around fearfully. The princess, holding the dog on her lap, with her dry, thin hands, looked attentively into Prince Vasily's eyes. But it was evident that she would not break the silence with a question, even if she had to remain silent till morning. You see, my dear princess and cousin Katerina Semyonovna, Prince Vasily continued, evidently getting himself to continue his talk only after an inner struggle. At moments like this, it is necessary to think of everything. It is necessary to think of the future, of you. I love you all like my own children, you know that. The princess went on looking at him just as dully and fixedly. Finally, it is necessary to think of my family, too, Prince Vasily continued, angrily pushing a little table away, and without looking at her. You know, Katish, that you 3 Mamontov sisters, and my wife as well, we are the Count's only direct heirs. I know how hard it is for you to speak and think about such things. It's no easier for me, and I'm over 50, my friend. I must be ready for anything. Do you know that I have sent for Pierre and that the Count, pointing directly at his portrait, demanded that he come?" Prince Vasily looked questioningly at the princess, but could not tell whether she was considering what he had said to her or was simply staring at him. "There's one thing for which I never cease praying to God, mon cousin," she replied, "that he have mercy on him and grant that his beautiful soul peacefully depart this." "Yes, that's right," Prince Vasily went on impatiently, rubbing his bald head and angrily seizing the little table he had pushed away and moving it towards him again. "But finally, the thing is, as you know yourself, that last winter the Count wrote a will according to which, passing over his direct heirs and us, he bequeathed all his property to Pierre." "He has written all sorts of wills," said the princess calmly, "but he cannot bequeath anything to Pierre. Pierre is illegitimate." "But mon cher," Prince Vasily said suddenly, clutching the little table to him, becoming animated and beginning to speak more quickly, "what if a letter had been written to the sovereign and the Count had asked to adopt Pierre? You understand, given the Count's merits, his request would be granted." The princess smiled as people smile who think they know more about a matter than those they are talking with. "I'll tell you more," Prince Vasily went on, gripping her hand. "The letter has been written, though not sent, and the sovereign knows of it. The only question is whether it has been destroyed or not. If not, then as soon as it's all over," Prince Vasily sighed, letting it be understood what he meant by all over, "and the Count's papers are opened, the will and the letter will be sent to the sovereign, and his request will most likely be granted. As a legitimate son, Pierre will get everything." "And our share?" asked the princess, smiling ironically, as if anything but that could happen. Ma pauvre Catiche, c'est clair comme le jour. He alone is then the legitimate heir to everything, and you won't even get this much. You must know, my dear, whether the will and the letter were written, and whether they have been destroyed. And if they've been overlooked for some reason, you must know where they are and must find them because—" "That's all we need," the princess interrupted, smiling sardonically and without changing the expression of her eyes. "I'm a woman. In your opinion, we're all stupid. But I know enough to be sure that an illegitimate son cannot inherit. Un bâtard," she added, supposing that this translation would definitively prove to the prince his groundlessness. "How is it you don't understand, finally, Catiche? You're so intelligent. How is it you don't understand? If the Count wrote a letter to the sovereign in which he asked that his son be recognized as legitimate, it means that Pierre will no longer be Pierre, but Count Bezukhov, and then according to the will, he'll get everything. And if the will and the letter have not been destroyed, there will be nothing left for you except the consolation that you have been virtuous et tout ce qui s'ensuit. That is certain. I know that the will has been written, but I also know that it is not valid, and you seem to consider me a perfect fool, mon cousin," said the princess, with that expression with which women speak when they suppose they have said something witty and insulting. "My dear Princess Katerina Semyonovna. Ugh. Prince Vasily began speaking impatiently. "I have come to you not in order to exchange barbs, but in order to talk with you, as with a kinswoman, a good, kind, true kinswoman, about your own interests. I tell you for the 10th time that if the letter to the sovereign and the will favoring Pierre are among the Count's papers, then, my darling, you and your sisters do not inherit. If you don't believe me, believe people who know. I've just spoken with Dmitri Onufrich." This was the family lawyer, "and he says the same thing." Evidently, something suddenly changed in the princess's mind. Her thin lips turned pale, her eyes remained the same, and her voice, when she began to speak, kept breaking into such tremors as she evidently did not expect herself. "That would be just fine," she said. "I don't want anything, and never did." She threw the dog off her lap and straightened the folds of her dress. "There's gratitude, there's thankfulness to people who have sacrificed everything for him," she said. "Wonderful, very fine. I need nothing, Prince." "Yes, but you're not alone. You have sisters," replied Prince Vasily. But the princess was not listening to him. "Yes, I've long known, but I had forgotten that apart from baseness, deceit, envy, intrigue, apart from ingratitude, the blackest ingratitude, I could expect nothing in this house." "Do you or do you not know where the will is?" Prince Vasily asked, his cheeks twitching still more than before. "Yes, I was stupid. I still believed in people and loved them and sacrificed myself. But only those who are mean and vile succeed. I know whose intrigue this is." The princess was about to get up, but the prince held her by the arm. The princess had the air of someone who had suddenly become disappointed in the whole human race. She looked spitefully at her interlocutor. There's still time, my friend. Remember, Katish, it was all done inadvertently, in a moment of wrath, illness, and then forgotten. Our duty, my dear, is to correct his mistake, to alleviate his last moments by not allowing him to do this injustice, by not letting him die thinking he has made unhappy those people who sacrificed everything for him. The princess picked up, again trying to rise, but the prince did not let her. Something he was never able to appreciate. No, mon cousin, she said with a sigh. I shall remember that one can expect no reward in this world, that in this world there is neither just honor nor justice. One must be cunning and wicked in this world. Well, voyons, calm down. I know your excellent heart. No, I have a wicked heart. I know your heart, the prince repeated. I value your friendship, and I wish you were of the same opinion about me. Calm down and parlons raison. While this time, maybe a day, maybe an hour, tell me all you know about the will, and above all, where it is. You must know. We'll take it right now and show it to the count. He has surely forgotten about it by now, and will want it destroyed. You understand that my only desire is to fulfill his wishes religiously. That is the only reason I've come here. I am here only to help him and you. Now I've understood everything. I know whose intrigue it is. I know, said the princess. That's not the point, dear heart. It's your protégée, your dear Anna Mikhailovna, who I wouldn't have as a housemaid, that vile, loathsome woman. Ne perdons point de temps. Ah, don't speak to me. Last winter she wormed her way in here and told the count a whole heap of such vile, such nasty things about us all, especially Sophie. I can't repeat it. That the count became ill and didn't want to see us for 2 weeks. I know it was then that he wrote that nasty, loathsome document, but I thought the document meant nothing. Nous y voilà. Why didn't you tell me anything before? It's in the inlaid portfolio he keeps under his pillow. Now I know, said the princess, not replying. Yes, if I have a sin, a great sin, it's my hatred of that loathsome woman. The princess nearly shouted, changing into a completely different person. And why is she worming her way in here? But I'll have it out with her. I'll have it all out. The time will come. Section 19. While such conversations were going on in the reception room and the princess's apartments, the carriage bringing Pierre, who had been sent for, and Anna Mikhailovna, who found it necessary to go with him, was driving into Count Bezukhov's courtyard. As the wheels of the carriage rumbled softly over the straw spread under the windows, Anna Mikhailovna, turning to her companion with words of comfort, discovered that he was asleep in the corner of the carriage and woke him up. Coming to his senses, Pierre followed Anna Mikhailovna out of the carriage and only then thought about the meeting with his dying father that lay ahead of him. He noticed that they had driven up not to the front, but to the back entrance. Just as he was stepping out, 2 men in tradesman clothes hastily ran away from the entrance into the shadow of the wall. Having stopped, Pierre made out several more men in the same sort in the shadow of the house on both sides. But neither Anna Mikhailovna nor the footman nor the coachman, who could not help seeing these men, paid any attention to them. So that is how it has to be, Pierre decided to himself, and went after Anna Mikhailovna. Anna Mikhailovna went up the dimly lit, narrow stone stairs with hasty steps, called to Pierre, who lagged behind her, and who, though he did not understand why in general he had to go to the count, and still less why he had to go by the back stairs, decided to himself, judging by Anna Mikhailovna's assurance and haste, that this had necessarily to be so. Halfway up the stairs, they were nearly knocked off their feet by some people with buckets who came running down the stairs, stamping with their boots. These people pressed themselves to the wall to let Pierre and Anna Mikhailovna pass, and did not show the least surprise when they saw them. Is this the way to the princess's apartments? Anna Mikhailovna asked one of them. Yes, the lackey answered in a bold, loud voice, as though everything was permitted now. The door on the left, good lady. Maybe the count didn't send for me, said Pierre, when he came to the landing. I'll just go to my own rooms. Anna Mikhailovna stopped so that Pierre could catch up with her. Ah, mon ami, she said with the same gesture as in the morning when she touched her son's arm. Croyez que je souffre autant que vous, mais soyez homme. Really, why don't I go? Asked Pierre, looking at Anna Mikhailovna affectionately through his spectacles. Ah, mon ami, oublie le tort qu'on a pu avoir envers vous. Pensez que c'est votre père. être l'agonie, she sighed. Je vous ai tout de suite aimé comme mon fils. Fiez à moi, Pierre. Je ne oublierai pas vos intérêts. Pierre understood none of it. He had still a stronger impression that this was how it had to be, and he obediently followed Anna Mikhailovna, who was already opening the door. The door led to the back stairs hallway. In the corner sat the princess's old servant knitting a sock. Pierre had never been in this part of the house. He had not even suspected the existence of these rooms. Anna Mikhailovna asked a girl who walked past them with a carafe on a tray, calling her dear and sweetheart, about the princess's health, and drew Pierre further down the stone corridor. The first room to the left from the corridor led to the princess's living quarters. The maid with the carafe, in her haste, everything was being done in haste just then in this house, did not close the door, and as they were passing by, Pierre and Anna Mikhailovna involuntarily glanced into the room where the eldest princess and Prince Vasily were sitting close together talking. Seeing them pass by, Prince Vasily made an impatient movement and drew back. The princess jumped up and in a desperate gesture, slammed the door shut with all her might. This gesture was so unlike the princess's usual calm. The fear that showed on Prince Vasily's face was so inconsistent with his augustness that Pierre stopped and looked at his guide questioningly through his spectacles. Anna Mikhailovna expressed no surprise. She only smiled slightly and sighed, as if to show that she had expected it all. Soyez home, mon ami, c'est moi qui velerai à vous intérêts, she said in response to his look, and went still more quickly down the corridor. Pierre did not understand what it all meant, and still less what veiller à vous intérêts meant, but he understood that it all had to be so. From the corridor they went into the half-lit salon adjoining the count's anteroom. It was one of those cold and luxurious rooms which Pierre knew only from the front porch. But in this room, too, in the middle of it, stood an empty tub, and water had been spilled on the carpet. They encountered a servant and an acolyte with a censer, who were walking on tiptoe and paid no attention to them. They went into the anteroom, so familiar to Pierre, with its two Italian windows opening on the winter garden, a big bust and a full-length portrait of Catherine. The same people, in almost the same positions, were sitting in the anteroom exchanging whispers. They all fell silent and turned to look at the entering Anna Mikhailovna with her pale, weepy face, and the big fat Pierre with his head hanging obediently following her. Anna Mikhailovna's face expressed an awareness that the decisive moment had come. With the manner of a businesslike Petersburg lady, she entered the room still more boldly than in the morning, not letting Pierre stray from her. She felt that, since she was bringing with her the person whom the dying man wished to see, her reception was assured. With a quick glance around, taking in everyone who was in the room, and noticing the Count's father confessor, not truly bending down, but suddenly making herself shorter, at a quick amble glided over to the father confessor and respectfully received a blessing first from the one, then from the other clerical person. "Thank God we're in time," she said to the clerical person. "We, his relations, were all so afraid. This young man is the Count's son," she added in a lower voice. A terrible moment. Having spoken these words, she went over to the doctor. "Cher docteur," she said, "ce jeune homme est le fils du comte. Y a-t-il de l'espoir?" The doctor was silent, raising his eyes and shoulders with a quick movement. Anna Mikhailovna was, with exactly the same movement, raised her shoulders and eyes, almost closing them, sighed, and walked away from the doctor towards Pierre. She addressed Pierre with a special respectfulness and tender sorrow. "Ayez confiance en sa miséricorde," she said to him, pointing to the little settee on which he could sit and wait for her, made inaudibly for the door that everyone was looking at, and following the barely inaudible voice of that door, disappeared behind it. Pierre, having decided to obey his guide in all things, made for this little settee she had pointed out to him. As soon as Anna Mikhailovna disappeared, he noticed the eyes of everyone in the room turned to him with something more than curiosity and sympathy. He noticed that they all had exchanged whispers, indicating him with their eyes, as if with fear and even obsequiousness. He was being shown a respect no one had ever shown him before. A lady unknown to him, who had been talking with the clerical persons, got up from her place and offered him a seat. The adjutant The adjutant picked up a glove Pierre had dropped and handed it to him. The doctors fell deferentially silent when he walked past them and stepped aside to make way for him. Pierre first wanted to sit somewhere else so as not to inconvenience the lady, wanted to pick up the glove himself, and to bypass the doctors who were not standing in his way. But he suddenly felt that that would be improper. He felt that night he was the person responsible for performing some terrible rite which everyone expected, and that he therefore had to accept services from all of them. He silently accepted the glove from the adjutant, sat down in the lady's place, putting his big hands on symmetrically displayed knees in the naive pose of an Egyptian statue, and decided to himself that this was precisely as it had to be, and that evening, so as not to lose his head and do something foolish, he ought not to act according to his own reasoning, but give himself up entirely to the will of those who were guiding him. 2 minutes had not gone by before Prince Vasily, in his caftan with 3 stars, holding his head high, majestically entered the room. He seemed to have grown thinner since morning. His eyes were larger than usual as he looked around and saw Pierre. He went over to him, took his hand, something he had never done before, and pulled it down as if testing whether it was well attached. Courage, courage, mon ami. Il a demandé de vous voir. C'est bien. And he was about to leave, but Pierre considered it necessary to ask, how is the health of... He hesitated, not knowing whether it was proper to call the dying man Count, yet he was embarrassed to call him father. Il a eu encore un coup. Il y a un demi-jour. Yet another stroke. Courage, mon ami. Pierre was in such a state of mental confusion that at the word stroke, he pictured some sort of blow to the body. He looked at Prince Vasily in perplexity, and only then realized that stroke referred to an illness. Prince Vasily spoke several words to Lorraine in passing, and went through the door on tiptoe. He did not know how to walk on tiptoe, and his whole body bobbed up and down awkwardly. The elder princess went in after him. Then the clerical persons and the acolytes went in. Then the servants also went through the door. Behind the door, movement was heard, and finally, with the same face, pale but firm in the fulfillment of her duty, Anna Mikhailovna rushed out and, touching Pierre's arm, said, La bonté divine est inexplicable. C'est la cérémonie de l'extrême qui va commencer. Venez. Pierre went through the door, stepping on the soft carpet, noticed that the adjutant and the unknown lady and some other servants all came in after him, as if there was no longer any need to ask permission to enter that room. Section 20. Pierre knew well that big room, divided by columns and an archway, all hung with Persian carpets. The part of the room behind the columns, where on one side stood a high mahogany bed under a silk canopy, and on the other an enormous stand with icons, was brightly lit with red light, as is usual in churches during evening services. Under the shining casings of the icons stood a long Voltaire armchair, and on the chair, its upper part spread with snow-white, unrumpled, apparently just changed pillows, covered to the waist with a bright green coverlet, lay the majestic figure, so familiar to Pierre, of his father, Count Bezúkhov, with the same mane of gray hair, reminiscent of a lion, above his broad forehead, and the same characteristically noble, deep furrows on his handsome reddish-yellow face. He lay directly under the icons. His 2 large, fat arms were freed of the coverlet and lay on top of it. In his right hand, which lay palm down, a wax candle had been placed between the thumb and the index finger, held in place by an old servant who reached from behind the armchair. Over the armchair stood the clerical persons in their majestic, shining vestments, with their long hair spread loose on them, lighted candles in their hands, performing the service with slow solemnity. A little behind them stood the 2 younger princesses, holding handkerchiefs to their eyes, and in front of them the elder princess, Katish, with a spiteful and resolute air, not taking her eyes off the icons for a moment, as if telling everyone that she would not answer for herself if she glanced back. Anna Mikhailovna, meek sorrow and all forgiveness on her face, and the unknown lady stood by the door. Prince Vasily stood on the other side of the door, close to the armchair, behind a velvet-upholstered chair, with its carved back turned to him. Resting his elbow on it, holding a candle in his left hand, crossing himself with the right, raising his eyes each time he put the fingers to his forehead. His face expressed calm piety and submission to the will of God. If you don't understand these feelings, the worse for you, his face seemed to say. Behind him stood the adjutant, the doctors, and the male servants, the men and women who were separated as in church. All were silent, crossing themselves. Only the church reading could be heard. The restrained bass singing, and in the moments of silence, sighing and the shuffling of feet. Anna Mikhailovna, with a significant air which showed that she knew what she was doing, went all the way across the room to give Pierre a candle. He lit it, and, diverted by observing the others, began to cross himself with the same hand in which he was holding the candle. The youngest, the red-cheeked, laughter-prone Princess Sophie, with the little mole, looked at him. She smiled, hid her face with her handkerchief, and did not uncover it for a long time. But looking at Pierre, she laughed again. She evidently felt herself unable to look at him without laughing, and could not keep from looking at him, and to avoid temptation, slowly moved behind a column. Midway through the service, the voices of the clergy suddenly fell silent. The clerical persons said something to each other in a whisper. The old servant who was holding the count's hand straightened up and turned to the ladies. Anna Mikhailovna stepped forward, and bending over the sick man, beckoned behind her back for Lorraine to come. The French doctor, who stood without a lighted candle, leaning on a column, in the respectful pose of a foreigner, which showed that, despite differences of belief, he understood all the importance of the rite being performed, and even approved of it, went over to the sick man with the inaudible steps of a man in the prime of life, took up his free hand from the green coverlid in his white, slender fingers, and turning away, began taking his pulse and pondering. The sick man was given something to drink. There was a stirring around him. Then everyone went to their places, and the service resumed. During this interruption, Pierre noticed that Prince Vasily had come from behind the back of his chair, and with that same look which showed that he knew what he was doing, and so much the worse for the others if they did not understand him, did not go up to the sick man, but passing by him, joined the eldest princess, and together with her made for the depths of the bedroom, to the high bed under the silk canopy. From the bed, both prince and princess disappeared through a rear door, but before the end of the service they came back to their places, one after the other. Pierre paid no more attention to this circumstance than to all the others, having decided in his mind once and for all that everything taking place before him this evening had necessarily to be so. The sound of the church singing ceased, and the voice of the clerical person was heard deferentially congratulating the sick man with having received the sacrament. The sick man went on lying in the same way, lifelessly and motionlessly. Around him everyone stirred. Footsteps and whispers were heard, among which the whisper of Anna Mikhailovna stood out more sharply than the rest. Pierre heard her say, "He must be transferred to his bed. Here it will be quite impossible." The sick man was so surrounded by doctors, princesses, and servants that Pierre could no longer see the reddish-yellow head with its gray mane, which, though he did see other faces, had never once left his sight during the whole service. By the cautious movements of the people standing around the armchair, Pierre guessed that the dying man was being lifted up and transferred. "Hold on to my arm, otherwise you'll drop him," the frightened whisper of one of the servants reached him. "From below, one more," voices said, and the heavy breathing and the tread of people's feet quickened, as if the load they were carrying was beyond their strength. The carriers, who also included Anna Mikhailovna, came even with the young man, and for a moment, over people's backs and necks, he saw the high, fleshy, bared chest and massive shoulders of the sick man, raised up by the people who held him under the arms, and his curly, gray, leonine head. The head, with its extraordinarily wide brow and cheekbones, handsome, sensual mouth, and majestic cold gaze, was not disfigured by the proximity of death. It was the same as Pierre had known it 3 months earlier when the Count had seen him off to Petersburg. But this head swayed helplessly from the uneven steps of the carriers, and the cold, indifferent gaze did not know where to rest. Several minutes were spent bustling around the high bed, and the people who had carried the sick man dispersed. Anna Mikhailovna touched Pierre's arm and said, "Venez." Together with her, Pierre went up to the bed, on which the sick man had been laid in a stately pose, evidently having to do with the just received sacrament. He lay with his head resting on the highly propped pillows. His hands were symmetrically laid out, palm down, on the green silk coverlet. When Pierre went up, the Count looked straight at him, but looked with a gaze the meaning and significance of which no man could possibly understand. Either this gaze said nothing at all, except that as long as one has eyes, one must look somewhere, or it said all too much. Pierre stood there, not knowing what to do, and looked questioningly at his guide, Anna Mikhalovna. Anna Mikhalovna made a hasty gesture with her eyes, indicating the sick man's hand, and sending it an airborne kiss with her lips. Pierre diligently stretched his neck so as not to snag the coverlet, followed her advice, and put his lips to the wide-boned and fleshy hand. Neither the hand nor a single muscle of the Count's face stirred. Pierre again looked questioningly at Anna Mikhalovna, asking what he was to do now. Anna Mikhalovna pointed him with her eyes to an armchair that stood by the bed. Pierre obediently began to sit down in the chair, his eyes still asking whether he was doing the right thing. Anna Mikhalovna nodded her head approvingly. Pierre again assumed the symmetrically naive pose of an Egyptian statue, evidently regretting that his clumsy and fat body took up so much space, and applying all his inner forces to making himself seem as small as possible. He looked at the Count, and the Count looked at the same space where Pierre's face had been when he was standing. Anna Mikhalovna's face expressed an awareness of the touching importance of this last-minute meeting of father and son. This went on for 2 minutes, which seemed like an hour to Pierre. Suddenly a shuddering came over the big muscles and furrows of the Count's face. The shuddering increased. The handsome mouth became contorted. Only here did Pierre realize how close to death his father was. A vague, hoarse sound came from the contorted mouth. Anna Mikhalovna diligently looked into the sick man's eyes, trying to guess what he wanted, pointed to Pierre, then to the drink, then in a questioning whisper named Prince Vasily, then pointed to the coverlet. The sick man's eyes and face showed impatience. He made an effort to look at the servant who never left his post at the head of the bed. He would like to be turned on that side, whispered the servant, and he got up to turn the Count's heavy body face to the wall. Pierre stood up to help the servant. As the Count was being turned, one of his arms was left hanging helplessly, and he made a vain attempt to drag it over. Either the Count noticed the horror with which Pierre looked at this lifeless arm, or some other thought flashed in his dying head at that moment, but he looked at the disobedient arm, at the expression of horror on Pierre's face, at the arm again, and on his face there appeared, so incongruous with his features, a faint, suffering smile as if expressing mockery at his own strengthlessness. Unexpectedly, at the sight of this smile, Pierre felt a shuddering in his breast, a tickling in his nose, and tears blurred his vision. The sick man was turned on his side to the wall. He sighed. Il est assoupi, said Anna Mikhalovna, noticing the princess coming to replace them. Allons. Pierre went out. And that is section 20. So we'll pick up with 21 tomorrow. More intrigue. The Russian court seems quite full of intrigue. I can't help feel a little bad for Pierre. He seems sort of like he doesn't seem to be a person with much strength of character, but also kind of disconnected. And the fact that he isn't even really there to say goodbye to his father who's dying, and everyone else is coming in and out, and they're just leaving him sit. It seems a little sad that wasn't kind of the Count is literally, they want to see his son before he dies, and everybody's like, let me go in first. Let's do this religious ceremony first. Bit silly, but interesting. So yeah, we'll pick up there tomorrow, ponder on all that and what Prince Vasily and the eldest princess are up to. Don't really think I like Prince Vasily that much. He seems like a schemer. Also, you don't notice it much in this chapter. Maybe we'll see in the next. But it's interesting to me that in some of the other chapters, Leo Tolstoy, I wonder if he has a lip fetish, because he just describes people's lips in such detail. It's so he's and you couldn't possibly mistake this distinctive way of their lips. So if you listen back in some of the other ratings, it's kind of funny how he describes it. So that was a thought I had a while back, and I wanted to share. But I think that's it for today, like I said. So tune in with me again tomorrow at 3. And we'll pick up where we left off. Have a great rest of your day, everyone. Happy Wednesday.